Hi, Sarah.
Hi. I have allergies. It's like bad. The spring is hard.
The part that's wild is it feels like somebody flipped a switch a week ago. Like I was fine, and then last Sunday it was like, click.
And you solved this problem for me. You gave me some clarity on this because it feels like the spring, we both live in big cities.
Yeah.
And it feels like the spring should not be so bad for people in cities.
You're like, why?
But in actual fact, in many ways, it's worse for people in cities because urban planning, when they decided they were going to green cities, which is good. I'm very pro greening cities. It's good for the environment. It's good for people. It's good for the whatever.
Good for everybody, right?
But when they decided they wanted to green cities, they were like, oh, well, we'll plant male trees because male trees grow differently than female trees do. They grow narrow rather than full. So they were like, it's great because it'll take up less space.
Sorry, I'm just really still laughing at narrow and full. I'm just a dirty girl. I'm sorry. I'm like,
it goes. That's how my father used to choose fennel for
you made
salads.
some gesturing.
Narrow rather than full.
Yes, it was more like a pinnacle than a bush.
This is true of many things in the plant world. The male of the species is smaller or is narrower. Anyway, but what they did not follow through on, like what these urban planners did not think through, was that male trees pollinate female trees.
The pollen, Sarah.
The pollinating, as it's just how it is here. This kid has been in my house for a full week, and originally she actually is sick, but I was like, if this kid just has bad allergies, what do you even do? Like, how do I get her to school?
The daffodils are up and the tulips are up, and that is not in all of my years in Chicago things that happen at the same time.
Yeah.
Right? Like the daffodils usually come up and then 3 or 4 weeks later, the tulips come up. And so it's also just like, boom, everything came up at once. And so it's just like, it feels like a new pollen cocktail for my senses to enjoy.
Yeah. It's all at once. It's just, so my hope is that we'll all go away at the same time too.
See, maybe that's it. Maybe it'll be like just a short, intense
burst
season
of intensity. And then other than that, I have nothing fun for banter. I mean, that wasn't fun at all, but I don't have anything fun for banter because I'm just writing. I'm in that point. Somebody on Instagram DM'd me, and it was a reader. It was somebody who I think was at Fate Mates Live. I can't remember who exactly, and I had been posting a bunch to the Instagram stories, and she wrote, "You're procrastinating."
Called out.
And I was like, oh,
red for fish.
How? There's a reason why I don't call my mom very much when I'm on deadline, everyone. Because you're procrastinating is accurate.
Yeah, well, speaking of moms, if you are one who celebrates such an event, Mother's Day in America is this weekend, but more importantly, next week, I will be interviewing Christina and Lauren for Love Sweet Arrow in Chicago. That's on May 14th.
That's so fun.
I actually have had a pretty fun romance spring. This past weekend, again, like time has no meaning when you're recording this far in advance, was at the Chicago North Romance Writers Spring Fling Conference. And there was a speaker who could not come at the last minute. And I was walking by. So the Chicago North Romance Writers puts on a really good conference for writers, and it's every other year. So these two women, Pam and Shannon, run this thing, and they are superstars. Like, they just put on a really good conference. Miss Bev and Kate Claiborne were the headliners.
For those of you who don't know, Jen said Miss Bev, but that is Beverly Jenkins. In romance world, many people call her Ms. Bev, but she's also known to the rest of the world as Beverly Jenkins.
Right. So they were the headliners, and then Brenda Jackson was also there. And like one night, Beverly Jenkins and Brenda Jackson had like a pajama party with everybody, which was super fun.
Amazing.
But I was walking past Pam and Shannon, who are these two really awesome women who put this conference on. And they are like, I don't know their actual positions with the romance writers. There's like a lot of really cool people. Kelly Farmer's a member. So they're walking by and kind of like, ooh, like, and I was like, well, what happened? You know, because I'm nosy. And one of their speakers couldn't show up. And I was like, well, do you want me to do something? Like, it's fine. And they were like, well, what are you going to do? And I was like, I don't know, I'll figure it out, right? And so
Sure.
I texted them or, emailed them later. I was like, well, what if I did something about like characters, kind of as like an editor and a reader? Like, what am I seeing or whatever? And the next morning I sort of prepped something and I like texted the group text and was kind of like, what do you guys think about this? And I got some really good ideas and put it together. And then Pam was like, it's so nice of you to do this last minute. And I was like, here's the truth, Pam. If you had asked me 8 months ago, I would have said yes. And then I would have spent 8 months feeling bad about myself for not preparing because I still would have prepared the morning of. So to me, this was ideal. I just prepared the morning of with no guilt.
Shame.
No shame, no guilt. Like, just like, I'm going to roll in and do this thing.
Perfect.
But here's the other part that was fucking awesome. The day I was leaving to go up there, it was in Chicago, but it was at O'Hare, which is basically like in traffic an hour and a half away from my house. So I was like, I'm just going to stay at the hotel. I got an email from one of my former students who writes romance now, and she was there, and we hung out.
Jen, that's so fun.
It was awesome.
Is she published?
No, she's working on her first book. And I was like, Margie, you are going to...
Margie, I can't wait to read your book.
Exactly. Isn't that awesome? So I had a really fun time.
Does she listen to the podcast?
Yes, that was weird. I was like, I'm just going to like let that go. But it was really fun. I hung out with a bunch of people. I saw a bunch of, people on the Discord.
Okay. There's a cute picture.
That's all I have for you, everybody.
I was like, pictures. Jem was like, no.
No, sorry.
Oh my gosh, but the pictures now from Fatemates Live are up, and people are so excited about them.
They're so
and they're
good.
we're recording this early because Jen knows that as we get closer and closer and closer to my deadline, I become less and less of a brain that can actually do anything but write. And so we do this ahead of time, and she basically forces it to happen in a great way. Like, this is great.
Yeah, I always feel really guilty. I'm like, we're going to record today. But we're so far ahead.
We've put up like 6 photos, and there are like 200. We're releasing them every week, but by now a big group of them are up. And you should, if you haven't, head to show notes at fatemates.net, and you can see, you can scroll through all of the. I'm only putting up, by the way, any photographs of people laughing.
Well, that's all there are.
Literally, there are some beautiful, beautiful pictures of some people who just look lovely and like are happy. Yeah. And I'm like, no, the laughter photos are going up.
That's it. That's all we care about.
And it's actually a real, they're pure endorphin. It's great. Also, can I just say, somebody really nice on the Discord posted this week. I don't know if you saw this note from Amanda, but on the Discord, and she said she just wanted to make a comment that she was scrolling through her Kindle collection for, reasons, and she realized how many books she's purchased because of us.
I know. Wasn't that nice?
And they're books that she would have passed on. So you guys, we love you, and we're so happy that you enjoy us, and that you end up buying the books that we talk about, which is really all we are interested in doing. We just want you to buy books.
Well, listen, I buy out a lot of the books they talk about, so it was great. The other really fun thing about Spring Fling is it was my first time in a while at like a signing. And the thing that was really funny is like 2 years ago, the signing was, still really...
It was a pandemic.
It was still kind of the pandemic, and there were not a lot of people there. And so I was like, don't worry, Kate, no one will be there. Okay, I was super wrong. It was a sea of people. It was
Did you have to buy a ticket to go to the signing, or was the signing open?
No, the signing was free.
Oh, that's really fun.
Lynn Painter was there, and so there are a lot of teenagers that came with like an older woman and stood in Lynn Painter's line. Lynn Painter has written a couple adult romances, but she writes great YA romances. I didn't even get a chance to meet her. So there were like tons of people, but like one of my favorite things to do, and of course, you guys, this book is in the car, so I'm going to put it in show notes, but I don't remember, is I like to walk up to people who I don't know their name, but their book covers for whatever reason look interesting. And I like to say, like, tell me about your favorite book. Like, what's your favorite book that you wrote? And this one woman was like, well, like, do you want a vampire? And I was like, yeah, tell me about a vampire. And she started telling me the story. And like I said, I don't remember the name, or the book is in my car right now. And she's like, this woman moves in and there's a man downstairs. And I was like, sold. Like, I just was like, yeah, that's what I want. Right.
Yeah, that's what I want.
And that's like a really fun way. Because I know the thing about signings is you get so like, okay, I'm here to see these people. But I like to really challenge myself at a signing. Like, give yourself a number. I'm going to buy 2 books or I'm going to buy 3 books from authors I have never heard of. Like, that to me is the fun of those events, is not just like seeing the people you know and love, but also like finding somebody new and having a chance to talk to an author about their books, and also, have like maybe a Tootsie Roll from their table.
Bring a Tootsie Roll. This
also,
is okay.
Oh, wait. I'm sorry. I have one more
Please,
thing.
you have something to say, and I want to hear it.
Okay, the other person I met there was this author who is, remember we've talked about the hymen on Romance Science? And we had a doctor email us and say, like, I'm a doctor. I could come on and talk about hymens.
Yeah.
I think her name's Jillian. She was there, and she was like, I was the one. And I was like, you're on our list. Don't worry. We're going to have you
Did you tell
on.
her about Megan Frampton?
Yeah, I did not, because I wanted to save it for the pod. So that's like a little bit of a
That's already
secret.
out. If you listen to that episode, it's out.
I couldn't remember. But anyway, I was like, for sure. So anyway, it was really, I had a great time at Spring Fling is what I'm trying to tell you,
Listen,
Sarah.
I think that's great. Can we talk also about these signings? Okay, here's what I want. I know some of you listen to the banter part and then you do actually do what we ask. So I'm going to say this. I'm going, and Jen is going to be there too. We are both going to be at, what's it called? Steamy Lit this August in Anaheim, California. That is ticketed only. There's no signing. You can't come if you're public. However, Jen and I have been talking about like maybe doing some kind of meetup. So stay tuned. If we do that, that will obviously be open. We'll figure out how to do it so that anybody can come. But that's not what I wanted to talk about. What I wanted to talk about was that is one of these like big, like sit in a big like conference room, the ballroom of a hotel and sign books for people. Which is, I will be super honest, not my favorite way to like meet readers, hang out with readers, or sign books. But, we do what we can. And I am excited about seeing people because I was supposed to go last year, but unfortunately my brother got very ill and so I wasn't able to go. So I'm coming this year. My question is this. As somebody who is not a like self-published, indie published author who like has books for sale at my table, although I am thinking of bringing like a case of those of my like contemporary Duke novella. What do you guys want at my table? Like, do I like, is it just like Tootsie Rolls? Like, do you want stickers? Like, what should I bring? Is there like something that like would compel you to visit a table remember also I write historical. So like that's kind of out in left field for these events these days. So like, help me figure out like, what is it that draws you to an author who's just like sitting at a table in a ballroom?
Well, Jillian had pill cases, like Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday.
That's so cute.
And I was like, listen, A+.
That's really useful and cool. They had her branding on it?
Yes.
Oh my God. See, that's the other thing that's so expensive, Jillian.
I know. She's a doctor. It all makes sense.
It really, that's perfect. A lot of other people, like, they have their books there, right? But like, and then the problem also is, so the bookstore that is doing Steamy Lit is Meet Cute, which is a fantastic indie. But, they're not going to have 200 copies of my book. So like you sell out, the 25 copies that they have, and then you're sort of sitting there for a day or two. And so that's my other thing is like, should I be there for both days? Like, I'm asking a lot of questions about like, what do readers really want?
I don't know if you know this, Sarah, but I have decided is that when you are signing, I should just hang out with you. And that way, at very least,
sure, you can just sign all
we
the books
can hang out
too.
together.
Jen will sign your book by me.
What I say, though, have you ever seen what I write, though?
Yeah.
I did not write this book, and then I sign it. Because I feel so weird about it. Like, I know you don't mind.
The only book that you really should not write that for is Imogen. Feels like you should just sign that. You should sign, you know what you should do on that? You should sign your own page, right? This is me.
Right, I say this is me.
So, and then sometimes people bring us like, I have signed a lot of copies of Dreaming of You. I have signed a lot of copies of Sweet Ruin.
I've signed Cressley's books.
Yeah. I usually sign Sweet Ruin. And it feels weird. And I also sign it. I did not write this book, but I love it.
Yeah.
And
I think that's fair.
Okay. Now we're gonna have a conversation about one of my very favorite things.
Welcome to Fated Mates, everyone.
Welcome. Eric's like, you guys have stopped introducing yourselves.
Well, here we are.
I'm Sarah McLean. I read romance novels and I write them.
And I'm Jennifer Prokop, a romance reader and editor.
And this week on Fated Mates, we are talking about dukes.
Dukes.
All things dukes.
We are kind of like narrowing it down. And then I was like, can we just like, Sarah's like, let's just talk about dukes.
I have a lot of things to say about dukes. And I feel like we don't talk about dukes enough.
We write about them enough.
We talk about plenty. We talk about dukes plenty. But like, I feel like we've been thinking a lot. Well, we should tell everybody. So we're 6 seasons in. And almost 7. I mean, almost the end of our 6th
exactly.
season.
We're getting towards the end of season 6.
We're 6 seasons into this thing. You guys are all still listening to us, which is really tremendous. And it's interesting because by this point, like, it feels in many ways like we've done the big interstitials. And we've talked about those big topics. And what I will say is I think starting kind of in season 7, we'll start revisiting those topics. One, because we have more to say. Like, for example, we've been talking a lot about the fact that we did this dark romance episode several years ago. And it was great at the time, but now it feels like obsolete in a lot of ways. Like there's so much more to say. Things change
so fast in romance.
Right. Like we're almost, I mean, it's crazy to think about it this way, but like we're almost like generationally in a new world than we were.
And I think that it's sped up too because of the pandemic, right? Like we've talked about romance generations being really short, but I think the pandemic was like the big reset button in a lot of ways.
Yeah. So, and now, I mean, we can sort of see like we have a lot to say is the point always. I mean, we're just big mouths. But what we've talked about is like in season 7, we'll start revisiting like some of the classic tropes and like rethinking like now what does it look like in 2024? Like how is the trope evolving? But that said, because of that, we're doing these kind of, in a lot of ways, micro-tropey things. Like, you know, we're talking about like something very specific that we're finding in texts or, you know, whatever. And I think that Jen, at least, you've been very good at like keeping us on task in terms of like, sometimes I'll say, well, let's do an episode about sex toys, for example. And you're like, but what is there really to say about sex toys? Like that we haven't already said in the context of, you know, when we did say Alexis Daria's, You Have Me at Hola, right? Like, where we talked about sex toys being, you know, about sexual freedom and like sex positivity. So, and then we're sort of like, well, if there isn't a ton to say about it, then what is the point of doing an episode about it? I think Dukes is one of those things where like there's a lot to say about the Duke as an archetype, as a concept, and like as the Duke as it has evolved through romance.
This week's episode of Fated Mates is brought to you by Faye Delacour, author of The Lady He Lost.
Jen, I'm like, how quickly can I read this book? Eli Williams was supposed to be dead.
Click.
I know. There it is.
I bought it already. There you go, everyone.
So his ship wrecked like at sea 2 years ago. And in the meantime, everybody has mourned him and moved on. His brother has spent his entire savings, and his fiancée has married another person. So when he returns in the middle of the London season, it is chaos, and everyone is gossiping, and no one knows what is happening. Like, how is this all going to go down? But all Eli wants is to like get his life back in order, figure out his affairs, and also reconnect with Jane Bishop, who was an old friend who always kind of meant more to him. And then he wants to get out of town and return to sea. But Jane has been pining over Eli forever.
Of course.
And Jen, this jerk, chose to marry her cousin instead of her.
No. Listen.
She said cold storage, and the universe sent him to a shipwreck.
I mean, he probably deserved it.
He definitely deserved it.
Sounds like he's going to recognize the error of his ways.
Listen, and Jane is like, forget you, Eli. I'm very busy. I've created a ladies gambling club. And he's like, but what about me? And she's like, get away from me. And he's like, but what if I just keep bringing you new members to your ladies gambling club? And then you have to be nice to me because I'm basically helping. So for all the ways that she is done with Eli and like knows that this is a bad idea, she kind of can't help but like want to kiss him in the darkness and probably do other things too while she's there.
That sounds lovely. So if you would like to read about this kind of grumpy woman and the sunshiny man who was shipwrecked and all of their adventures, then you definitely want to check out The Lady He Lost. It also has, that second chance romance vibe and a really independent heroine, which of course you will love, because why else would you be listening to Fated Mates? So as a special treat for our listeners, at the end of this episode, we have an audio excerpt of The Lady He Lost available for you to get a jump start on. But I know that you're all interested. So if your podcasting app supports it, click on the title right now to be taken to a link to buy the book. Thank you to Faye Delacour for sponsoring this week's episode.
We have talked very much over the years about historical being the subgenre of romance that is kind of doing cultural work in a more overt way. Like, I don't know if I'm framing that correctly, but like all romance does cultural work, right? But like the historical romance tends to be like dealing with like the politics of bodies in a more overt way.
Yeah,
right?
There's some freedom there because you are divorcing it from modernity.
Right. And so like the struggle, often the conflict in a historical is often like related to, feminism or bodily autonomy or jobs or money. Like you can sort of mine those things that are still issues today without it feeling like, oh, and now she's just like...
Without it feeling didactic, without it feeling preachy, without it feeling... Right. No one feels personally implicated by their actual position on the Corn Laws because that happened a long time ago.
Sure. And so there's a lot of shorthanding that goes on in historicals, but it's shorthanding in relationship to politics in a lot of ways. It's so there, there's something historicals does that's more challenging to do in other genres, in other subgenres, I think. So there's that, right? The Duke as in that world. And then I think there's like Duke as power, which is a kind of whole separate thing that, is worth negotiating and worth noodling. And then I think there's this other piece that's about the way we talk about dukes publicly and the way we read dukes privately. And I've been thinking a lot about this because there's this like kind of bubbling up of conversation around babies in romance and like pregnancy in romance right now, like literally over the last couple of weeks, in part brought on by Reform Rakes doing an episode about pregnancy, and also this kind of what feels like is the, quote, right thing to say publicly about some of the tropes, some of the things that are in these books, right? Meaning like baby logs or like pregnancy popping up, or like, is pregnancy really like, does it have to be a plot point? Like, is it always there in these conversations?
Like, is pregnancy a trope?
Pregnancy is not a trope, everyone. That's just a thing that happens. Like, secret baby is a trope. Pregnancy is just a thing that happens to a body. But this is not about pregnancy. We're not doing that today. Right. We'll do that another time, maybe. But I think that Dukes, weirdly, like having that conversation being in the ether has made me think about Dukes in a specific way too.
I think what's interesting about Dukes is, I don't know, I guess I just think it's interesting to think about the way they've changed longitudinally, right? Like, and I mean a couple different things. One is, of course, like back in the day when I first started reading romance, like they didn't all have to be dukes. I mean, you know what I mean? Like sometimes they were like barons or earls or whatever, right?
I mean, right now it's Bridgerton fever. Bridgerton is also out this weekend. And I think that's a great example. There's one Duke.
Yeah.
And it's not a Bridgerton. And that's an old book, right? That's a 25-year-old book.
Yeah, like that really changed. Right now, somehow they all would be dukes. It's fascinating how dukes are so ascendant, or have been for a while, when so many more historicals are like out of the ballroom, right? And also, I think the part that's interesting is there's so many more different identities, kinds of people writing about dukes. Dukes aren't just like, rich white guys anymore in modern historical romance. And I think that's another reason why I am loath to kind of be like, kind of people are like, I don't ever want to read about a duke. Because listen, I like reading about dukes. And everybody, I feel like sometimes that's like one of those things where sometimes I feel like it's like people think it's the right thing to say. But then I'm like, listen, everybody wouldn't be doing dukes if dukes weren't selling. You know what I mean? Like, it's a business too, right?
Let's get down to brass tacks, because I am in a unique position to be able to speak to this, right? Having written, I should have counted, more dukes than fewer. How about that? I think probably if you looked at my books if you looked at all 19 of them, the lion's share of those heroes are dukes. And I think that the reason why that is, well, maybe not the lion's share, but like half, I would think probably are dukes. And the reason why that is because dukes sell. To the point where sometimes a book has a duke in it, but the title that you have come up with does not have the word duke in it. And your publisher says, is there a way to get duke in the title? And I've seen this work multiple ways. I've seen publishers like shove duke into a title for books that don't have dukes in them. Like where the story revolves around like a dukedom, but the characters are not dukes. As much as we like to say like, oh, everybody on Twitter says like dukes are passé, like nobody wants to read them. They're old, they're over. Everybody wants books that are like not about the aristocracy. They want working class heroes. I will tell you from my sales numbers, it is not true. Like, and when I say that, and this is me, like really short of giving you numbers, like specifically, which I will not do, what I will tell you is that the books that have duke in the title sell almost double in the long run what the books that don't have duke in the title sell.
And I mean, I remember when I first got on like romance Twitter and then like realized like the people who are part of like Romancelandia in social media, regardless of like what platform, are minuscule compared to the number of people who are just going to their local library
and
or going to
tipping
Walmart
the books into their cart.
And right, those are, or buying them from Amazon or buying them on BookBub. Like one is very small and one is very big, and that's the thing. It's kind of like I feel like sometimes and it's hard because I think that like people who aren't authors have a hard time hearing that because they're just like, yeah, but I'm bored with it. And you're like, okay, that's fine.
And that's legitimate.
But here's a romance author, a historical romance author saying twice as many.
I think what's interesting here is like there are a number of things coded into this. This is not me saying like any of these people are lying. Like I'm not saying like, oh, you're saying publicly that you don't want them and then you're secretly reading them. Like I don't think that's necessarily true at all. Like I believe you that you're tired of it.
They're not the only people buying your books.
And I think that there is a moment where we as writers, and I will say, I will qualify, not all of us, right? Like, especially in historical, all of this conversation is qualified with, like, historical has a lot of failings, right? Like, there is a history of, like, a lot of problematic content in historicals, in many ways because the genre was kind of built on the backs of historicals. The historically publishing has been very white. It's been very straight. It's been very, all of the things we've talked about, right? Over the years, all of the things that we need to keep talking about. And historical is very much has that in its DNA, right? And I think, unfortunately, also has it in it. I don't think it has it in its DNA any more or less than any of the other subgenres. I think that because it is also about a time where this was codified institutionally into society, it feels like more glaring, right? Which is a thing that we are all that many of us are trying to reckon with, right? And I think historical is in a place right now trying to sort that out and also try to rebrand itself in a lot of ways to modern readers who are hesitant to walk into that world because it feels very cishet, white, classist, etc., ableist. That said, I think what's happening in modern historicals, like current historicals over the last, say, 5 or so years, since we started the podcast, let's say, this generation, whatever it is a kind of sense of, well, how do we pull the historical out of the ballroom so we're not negotiating with aristocracy as being of value in the same way, but also deliver the dukedom to readers. And that is a very difficult needle to thread. And so I see people, having this conversation in the Discord or online. Sometimes I'll run into it where it's and then all these historical authors are trying to do cartwheels to get a duke who's divested his wealth, right? This is a duke who has not made his money, is not capitalizing on the slave trade, is not capitalizing on the problematic class system or colonialism or, right? And that is a huge problem because the money comes from power and inequity, right? So the best you can do, and I'm saying it as somebody who's written half my books are about dukes, right? The best you can do is sort of say, this one's not a terrible guy, right? There's money and he lives in this beautiful house and he has all the trappings of wealth and he's inherited all of this. And, initially we had said what we wanted this episode to be was dukes who had inherited the dukedom. And the reason why there's such a rise in that right now is because you can then sort of, wash away generational ism by giving it to somebody who toiled. And I don't know what to say. There's no solution here. There's no right way to do it. It's never going to be perfect because this is what we're talking about when we're talking about institutions of power. Right. So I guess what I'm saying is the Duke is no different than the vampire king or the contemporary billionaire who also benefits from inequity and power and generational wealth. So I think it's really fascinating because I think we are all in kind of a society that values capitalism and values power in a way that codes it as sexy and codes it as the fantasy in a lot of ways. And so all of romance is reckoning with this on different levels, but the Duke feels like the biggest one.
This week's episode of Fated Mates is brought to you by Stephanie Rose, author of Second Time's the Charm.
Jesse is going through it. Overnight, he became a father to his niece when his sister died, and he has no choice but to move back to his hometown after 20 years away. And he is trying to pick up the pieces and do right by his niece, who has is really, really going through it. So when his 20th high school reunion rolls around, he decides he's going to go and he's going to resume communication with people in this small town, and he comes face to face with Emily, the ex whose heart he broke before she could break his. Before he took off out of town. Old feelings come rushing back. She's still perfect in every way. But Jesse does not have time for a relationship. He is very busy, like trying to figure out how to live his life, his new weird life. But then it becomes clear that Emily is going to be around for a long time because she's his niece's soccer coach. And she's so pretty, Jen, and she smells so good. And after a liquor-fueled night of confessions, he can't help but tell her exactly how he's been feeling back then and now. And they get to try it all over again. This is a real second chance.
Yeah, and I love this. High school sweethearts 20 years later, single dad in a small town. What more do you need? This is a new release from Stephanie. It actually comes out on May 10th, so you can pre-order now. It is available in print, or with your monthly subscription to Kindle Unlimited. So if you click now before the 10th, it will take you to a link where you can pre-order, or if you listen after the 10th, then you can just click and buy. Thank you to Stephanie Rose for sponsoring this week's episode. I think like at its core, it's kind of like, well, what's the fantasy of romance, right? Like, and you've said many times, like, right? Like the Duke is the rock star, is the quarterback, right? The king. And I think that like, you know what I mean? Like, I don't know. I don't really read hockey books, but I'd like be really curious. Like, do they mostly play a certain position?
Quarterback. Yeah. Like, yeah.
A lot of it is just like a shortcut for like power itself. Right. And I think it's also though, like, look, I will say it like, I just listen, like, I like the idea of like pretty dresses and fucking ballrooms and like, it's like why I watch literally will watch like the beginning of any show where like Hollywood celebrities are going to show up and get awards and never the show itself. Like, I just want to see beautiful people wearing beautiful clothes. Like, you know what I mean? And I think that I'm not going to feel embarrassed for that. Like, I like that in a romance too, right? Like, she's going to like put on this dress and go to the modiste and he's going to wear this beautiful suit of clothes. Like, I'm sorry. Like, there's a big part of the fantasy of romance for me is really tied up in like those experiences, which I will like never have in my life.
1,000%. And I think there's also all aspects of society kind of feel like of entertainment play with it. It goes back to, we've talked about this on the podcast before, but Jennifer Lynn Barnes's like theory of like the universal id, right? And she uses when we use the term universal in this concept, obviously we don't mean every single person. We just mean like it is a kind of like big, it's like cultural. And in her case, she's a primatologist. And this research came from her research with monkeys, where she was like, it's pure id, like their brains are wired from creation to fire when they experience these things. And one of the things that she includes in it is wealth. It's like an id. It's an id structure. It's like more, right? Like and it feels like this makes sense from the cavemen, right? Like more, like keep having resources. And so I think, yes, it's part of the fantasy. It's particularly part of the fantasy when we are sort of raised with this kind of sense of money being, we can say all we want, money doesn't buy happiness, but like money being essential to not just survival, but like to thrive. Like, and it makes things easier. So I think what romance is able to do in a lot of ways with these heroes, with wealthy heroes at least, right, is clear the table of really basic problems, right? Like you never will have to worry about how you're going to pay your phone bill with these guys. And then on top of it, not only will you never have to do any of that basic stuff, like also like they'll fix any problem. And I think that's when we get to the corn laws, right? Which is our shorthand for like, it's pure fossils, right? But like most people, Cat Sebastian aside, like most people can't like tell you anything about the corn laws.
Right. Like, I'd imagine historical romance authors understand the ins and outs of the corn laws or the sweeper laws. Can little boys go up the chimneys or whatever, right?
It's sort of it is a big shorthand, right? Being able to, like, putting up all of these wealthy, titled men are also politicians, right? Like, they are, and what I mean by that, they're not politicians. They are required to go and sit in Parliament and make law. And look, that's a big problem. Like, in real life, that's a big problem, putting all these wealthy people in a place and saying, like, all of you need to decide.
Well, come on, our Senate, our Congress
Look around us. This is not a good way to run a country.
So it's not like we figured out a way to, like, replicate it without actual titles.
So we can also say, like, oh, but look, they've gone to Parliament and they've voted on, like, women's rights or children's rights and I mean, I'm guilty of this. I have written these characters who sit in Parliament and do the right thing.
I mean, like, noblesse oblige is a thing. Like, it's not like we don't have names for these concepts, right?
What's fascinating, and another piece of the sales on the back end, is dukes sell better than princes, better than kings. They sell the best. And I believe that the reason why they sell the best is because we all have sort of, one, I think Americans have a kind of innate disgust for royalty. Ironically, right? Because it's not like the aristocracy is that much different, right? But I think, like, it's coded into the DNA of the United States that, like, we can't like princes and kings the same way. And I think also dukes have freedom to break rank in an interesting way. And in romance, that happens a lot. Like, way back, like back into the McNaught Dukes of the 80s. These were people who would stand up and say, like, that's not right, in a way that a prince or a king cannot.
And I think there's also, like, the suspension of disbelief. I know full well that, like, the oldest one, the prince, has to marry a certain, you know what I mean? Like, so there's, like, a lot of ways that I'm just like, come on. And I think that is one of the things with dukes is it's just, like, generically, like,
how'd they make their money?
Who knows what they do, right? Like, that, I mean, I think in that way, I am a very classic, like, American with, like, a really probably very terrible history instruction at like through the high school and secondary level and college level.
You only know the corn laws exist because of romance novels. Yes.
Absolutely. And I think that there's part of it that's, like, one of the things that's really interesting to me is when I read, like, the old, like, medievals, one of the things that's really interesting to me when I think about those books is those are the dukes who, like, first got awarded the dukedom for killing a bunch of people for the king.
Yeah. Oh, no. Those dudes know how the business end of a sword.
And there's, like, a rawness to those guys.
Yes. Yes.
And then over generations, right, they become kind of formalized into, like, pure dandies in some ways. And I really like one of my favorite, and we've talked about this book before, is, like, Devil's Bride by Stephanie Lawrence.
Yep. We did a deep dive on it in season 2.
And I remember the first time I read this book because he had, like, come back from Waterloo and he and all of his cousins had survived. His cousins and brother, he had a brother, had survived. And I remember being like, oh, this is hot.
No, this is a duke who has chops.
Closer to the, you know, the Black Lion era of dukes, right? Like, where you're like, these guys became dukes because they fucked somebody up. And the king was like, great, here's some land for you.
This will not surprise you at all, right? But, like, for me, one of the challenges of it in the arc of my career, right? So, like, I wrote, my first hero was a marquess. Yes, is that right? Ralston's a marquess, yes. And then there's a duke in that series. And then the second series was the casino series. And then since then, the challenge that I have had, and I have written almost exclusively aristocrats, a handful of non-aristocrats, right? What became very quickly a problem for me was idleness, right? Which is sort of coded into the aristocracy here. Like, you have to have a job in my, like, it's very difficult for me to write a character who doesn't have purpose. And so I think that that's the other piece of it. I think there is this kind of sense of there are two kinds of dukes in these worlds. Like, you've named, there's the duke who has like a purpose. And that can even be like, I'm thinking about the dukes who are impoverished and like have to rebuild their, like, so the way the aristocracy works, for those of you who don't read historicals, like, at least in the context of Romancelandia, right? Like, Romancelandia aristocracy inherits a house. I mean, this is true of regular aristocracy too, but they inherit the house. And historically, currently, that's a whole separate thing. But they inherit the house and they inherit the land around the house. And the land is in many ways worked by what are called tenant farmers, who essentially like lease plots of land from the duchy, right? The dukedom itself. And they pay taxes. They like pay a tithe, they like whatever. And so if the person who's in charge, the duke, does not properly manage his land, he doesn't cycle the crops properly, he's not like making sure that the tenants' roofs are all thatched. Like, if he's a bad landlord, he makes less money and the whole thing like falls into disrepair. This is a classic beginning. There are literal thousands of historical romance novels that begin this way. A terrible father dying, a ne'er-do-well Reiki son inheriting this space, or not necessarily Reiki, although I do like it when he's a rake, inheriting this property and then having to kind of renovate his... we talked about this a little bit with Nikki Payne. Like, he has to thatch roofs and like, you know, get out there and like take off his shirt in the sun, right? And dig trenches in the soil. And like, this is the hero of the play. A man who has to rebuild this like once stunning, you know, thing to its former glory. And that's really great. That is a really fun book to read.
Yeah, and if you're interested in that, although he's not a duke, I don't think isn't
that why Westcliff marries?
Well, yeah, right. Like, I was gonna say,
he's an earl,
I mean, Lisa
yeah.
Kleypas has this, right? But like, he's an earl, or in Cold Hearted Rake, Devon,
wait, isn't that
who is
Saint
also
Vincent
an earl,
too?
like,
Doesn't he need money?
Yeah, but he's not going to get it by working. His father is still alive, because this is the other thing we have to talk about, which is like the dead dads, right? Like, you can't be a duke unless your dad's dead.
This week's episode of Fated Mace is sponsored by Beth Gelman, author of Always Falling Behind.
Abigail Farnsworth Burton has a bit of a problem, a good problem to have, though, which is, even though she's pretty young, only 24, she's been taking care of an aunt her entire life, but all of a sudden she has learned that she is the sole heiress to this huge fortune. And so she's like, awesome, I'm going to pack up my belongings into my car. I think it's like a red Corolla, and I'm going to like make my way to my new life. Only 400 miles from her new life and her new mansion and her new money, her car breaks down.
Oh, and who happens by, Jen? Because I'm guessing someone does.
Fortunately, a very handsome man who's also a car mechanic. What
Perfect.
are the chances?
No notes.
His name is Elias McGinnis. And she cannot believe that anyone who would offer to help her could be like, he's so hot and so nice. Like, right? Like, surely if she tells him her whole entire life story, he will be the one to help her get to her new life. And in fact, he does. So Elias joins her on this quest, and they end up essentially, really, he's like really instrumental, because as it turns out, when you all of a sudden have old money attracts new enemies, as it turns out. And
boy.
Elias is going to be the one to help her kind of figure it all out.
Well, this sounds adorable, and you can find Always Falling Behind in print or ebook, or with your monthly subscription to Kindle Unlimited. If your podcasting app supports it, you can click on the chapter title right now to be taken directly to purchase the book. And thanks to Beth Gelman for sponsoring this week's episode. A few years ago, when Twitter was still like robust and I was still on it, I remember tweeting like, can anyone think of a romance novel where both sets of parents are alive and also decent, right? Like, and like it basically can't be done. I mean, now it can be. It's not quite the same. This is a positive evolution in romance, but like for about 40 years of romance, that did not exist. Nobody had parents.
And you weren't particularly sad about it. They just were gone.
The father was always terrible anyways. So I think all of that is true. Like, I think the Duke is shorthand for so much. And then on top of it, now there's this layer of like, look, historical's in chaos right now, right? Like, I'm going to be super honest. Everybody's, look around. There is not a ton of historical that's being written, like, and published traditionally, like, to great fanfare. Like, we're just not seeing the level of historical romance out there that we used to.
Now, the one upside is I feel like there have been a lot of people finding self-published historical that they really, really like. You know what I mean? And so I think that, like, luckily we live in a time where, okay, traditional historical there's not as much, but like that doesn't mean if you're not out on the hunt for new things, you can't find them. I mean, this is like the blessing of self-publishing as well,
1,000%.
Right?
But without like the backing of traditional, well, what I would say is that as successful, as much as people are finding it in self-published, they're not finding at the same level at which they're finding contemporary, for example, or romantasy. And I think traditional publishing is just, I do think like there are a lot of editors and houses in traditional publishing who are like, we don't even know. We don't know what to do. Like, historical just doesn't sell, right? And I think that that's about I think that's about a misperception of what the genre is.
Yeah.
And what's inside the books. I think it's about covers. Like, I think it's about it's about packaging. It's about the fact that you can't find mass market anywhere, and most historicals are in mass market. I mean, there are a lot of different pieces of this puzzle. But I think that there's also this kind of very real sense that the Dukes are, like, Dukes can't be decent people. And I think it's interesting because they're no less likely to be a decent person than a billionaire is. But I think because that is the train of thought that we have about Dukes, about like billionaires too, there is something even more kind of id and like, really like internally exciting about a Duke who's a great dude, who like turns out to like see his own, and also has to grow. You gave your speech this week about character growth being essential. And like, you want to know who has no choice but to grow? A rich, entitled asshole. If he is going to believably deserve love, he is going to have to change. Why don't you talk about that?
Often, right? Like, sort of the starting point for a Duke. Even one who is like, my duchy is worth nothing and I have to marry some heiress. Like, think about Joanna's book, The Duke.
Duke Gets Even.
Right? Like, here is a guy who for several books is like, basically, I am in America hunting for an heiress. That is my job right now. Because without the cash infusion that at this point, the aristocracy is tapped out. You know what I mean? Like, and that's like the fun thing about like a lot of the historicals we grew up reading were just pure Regency. But once they move into Victorian and Gilded Age, now you're seeing that these, like, there's not enough money to keep these places afloat. Like, farming has changed. Trains have come. We are like literally in a new era, and I can't afford to keep this like 800 room house. Mm-hmm. And so you have even guys like that are still like so fucking arrogant, right? And so like one of the things we talked about so I did a really interesting like 5-minute for a bird that was actually 15 minutes with one of our listeners, Anna Q. She has a PhD and she loves Cold Hearted Rake more than Mary Winterbourne. And I was like, oh, look at you, saucy. But one of the things we talked about is I was like, I think that when you look at the beginning of Cold Hearted Rake, Theo, who is an aristocrat, is spoiled. He is terrible. He does not care about his family. He is, right? Like in Cleopas's world, the aristocracy will spoil you, right? Money will not. Money, Tom Severin, Winterbourne,
Right,
like
'cause it's
industry, work, right? As you were saying, because it's work, you're going to be making it yourself is a different beast. And I think one of the things this then is really interesting is even even in Joanna's book, like he is like, I have been searching for a rich woman to marry for however many books before I got my own. But we never see him as ever being like brought low by this situation or this circumstance, right? The lack of funds is just a temporary problem to be fixed. Whereas for most people, it is an existential crisis, right? Like I can't live. And so I think that there's a way in which like no matter what, the reason every Duke has to be on a personal growth journey is because every single one of them is because they start off so fucking full of themselves.
Yeah.
Even ones who are brought low in some way are never brought as low as they will be by this person they fall in love with.
No. The other thing that, I talk about all the time is this sense of like in the conflict of the book, like over the course of the book, we have to see, and in this case with an arrogant, entitled Duke, you have to see at the end him willing to give up all of it for her, for love, right? And I think what's fascinating about this is there is an innate conflict there because he has to be willing to give everything up for her, but at the same time, he has to also be willing to take responsibility for all of the shit that he has to deal with, right? And I think that is the thing that is more modern. I think more modern historicals are grappling with that responsibility balance in an interesting way, right? Because it's like they can't just walk away from title because people rely on them.
Think about the Courtney Milan book. Like, is it called The Duke Who Didn't? Right? Like, that's a really good example of like responsibility weighing on him in a way that like ends up having like a really cool ending, right? I won't spoil it if you haven't read it, but like this is like Courtney really understands the way in which he has responsibilities towards the tenants or like, the people in the town, like you know what I mean? Like it's essentially like every Duke is running a company town. And that is a huge responsibility once they tune into my responsibility is not just to like me and my money. Those are the bad Dukes, right? The good Dukes are the ones who are like, and the reason that all exists is because of these people.
And so when they thatch the roof, it's an important moment. I think there's also something to the I said this before, that there's this kind of rise of heroes who inherit the dukedom. And I said initially that it was in many ways so that writers could like kind of shorthand, like you can like kind of separate the money from him in some sort of intention, like he's not a colonialist. like he just happened to like benefit from it, I guess, like by accident, right? He's like 12th in line. I wrote A Scot in the Dark, like the joke in A Scot in the Dark, and like the kind of wink to historical readers is that he was 17th in line to this dukedom, and in 2 weeks, like 16 people die,
16,
like in like freak accidents, like King Ralph style. It's a deep cut, but like I think, and so it ends up that he inherits like he inherits like a passel of houses that like he doesn't even know all the houses that he owns. Like he inherits her, right? Like she was the ward to like Duke number 4. And so, like she has no one, and he's like, and I have all these houses, and wait, a human? Like, what's happening? And so, like, that was me being like, hi, romance readers, this is stupid, right? Like, this is a silly, silly thing. So I'm going to show you how silly it can be. And then, of course, like he's the opposite of a duke. He's like breaking furniture and like he's just pure muscle and like man.
That's like one of my favorites of your books.
But I want to say something about this because I think there is something to the kind of like disgust that often like there is what we give these kind of new dukes, the like ones who didn't grow up in the aristocracy. What we give them is like a real disdain for it. So they can voice it and say like, I hate it. I hate this. This isn't what I was raised to be. This isn't how this should be. There's a great kind of like Cinderella book called The Duke Most Wanted by Celeste Bradley. And this is one of those ones where like he inherits a dilapidated estate and he needs a wealthy wife, right? And his best friend in the world, this is like, or I don't know if they're friendly. I don't know if they're like best friends, but like the heroine, her, like there's a fortune that's like willed to her, but like he only like somebody dies and he only has daughters. And he's like, my whole fortune will go only to like the first one who marries a duke. And so she knows this guy and like, she's like, this is fine. Like my older sister's going to marry a duke. Like I can just be a wallflower. We can just be friends. Like it doesn't matter. And then he unexpectedly inherits a dukedom. But then he goes out to find a rich bride and like, she's not even on his list because she's like a wallflower and like has no interest. She like, I'm not going to marry. Like I have no interest in any of this. And then she has to like basically be Cinderella. Like she gets a full makeover. It's really like a classic romance. I have to imagine it was written in the early thousands. Like, but it's really exactly this. It's this sort of like the glow up for both of them is about like accepting that the title is theirs now. This week's episode of Fated Mates is sponsored by Louisa Darling, author of The Matrimony Trap.
Okay, so what we have here is a bit of a parent trap situation. Caroline Quick has been raised by her parents to like be a naturalist, and she just loves the outdoors. And after her father's death, she and her mother go back to London, and she's pretty sure that like, you know, everything is just going to turn out the way she wants. This is just like a little side trip. But once she's there, she realizes like her mom actually loves London, and her agreement to go and like be in the woods with Caroline is maybe like not the best thing for her mom. And so Caroline has this pretty great idea, which is if I can marry my widowed mother off, perfect. And she figures the perfect person to marry her off to is her first love. And so
she's going to need help, I guess.
Yeah. So she's like, I'm going to approach his son and together we will like arrange this.
Terrific.
Yeah. And Fitz is like, listen, I don't really want to be married by myself, but what is up with your crazy schemes? And maybe leave my dad out of it. But also he can't really help be drawn into like her plan, right? Like she's just very convincing. She's
so pretty and smells so good.
Yes, obviously. Okay, so they go off to a house party. There's going to be some surprise encounters. They're going to set it all up. Only maybe these two are falling into the trap themselves.
I love it.
Who could have expected it, Sarah?
If anybody is looking for a nerdy heroine and a himbo hero, so like real Barbie and Ken energy here, this one is for you. This is a historical romance novella that is available in ebook wherever you get your books. If your podcasting app supports it, you can click on the chapter title right now to be taken to purchase the book. Thanks to Louisa Darling for sponsoring this week's episode.
I think some of my favorite books of the past, of like the recent, past, are ones that show that like, okay, like it comes with some caveats, right? Like it's not all champagne and caviar. And one of my favorite series is actually called The Duke's Daughters by Megan Frampton, because in this series by Megan, essentially, it starts off with like this poor man has like 4 or 5 daughters. And so, it's like, yeah, you can be a duke, but if all you have are daughters, you have to marry them off and you have to, find ways to get them essentially like, good husbands, and they've been raised in, like this, in like the upper echelon. So, you know what I mean? Like I really love that thought of like, what, and then if you're like a duke, if you're one of 4 or 5 duke's daughters and there's no brothers, then you're just like a disappointment, right? Like there's a way in which like, I mean, and that's like one of my other favorite things about like anytime, like there's a new duke and he's like, oh, I didn't want this, for some woman to look at him and be like, fuck you. Like, oh, the patriarchy gifted you with this thing and you don't want it. You know what I mean? Like, what about me? And I think like I really enjoy that like recent historicals give voice to that tension, right? Like one of my favorite characters in the Ravenels is it's not Lady Danbury, that's Bridgerton, but like there's an older woman who is, there's no heir, there's no male heir. And so she knows that like once her husband dies, she is at the mercy of someone who very well might not take care of her. That, the more I read about like dukes or aristocracy, becomes like really interesting to me, the ways in which these books then actually become a vehicle for highlighting the ingenuity of women.
Absolutely.
Right. And I just don't think that people think about it this way, right? Like you're looking at it and seeing, blah, 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 the duke who didn't. And then instead, it's this great story about an amazing woman. And I think that that is like a real like pill in the peanut butter, as we would say, right? Like you think you're getting one thing or the title is promising one thing, but instead a lot of these books are delivering really cool stories about women who are just like, well, how am I going to get around this?
Yeah.
What am I going to do?
Exactly. Well, I mean, not to mention the fact that there is also this is that the addition to that book that you've just talked about, or that sort of concept that you've just talked about, is like the Dowager Duchess books, the widowed Duchess who has to figure out how to like make it all like how to keep it all together, like in the wake of losing the figurehead, right? Because in most of those books, right, like it is the Duchess who like has been holding it together anyway the whole time. This terrible husband dies and now she has to like get the children married, or like, figure out how she's going to survive. Like what happens when the new duke arrives? Like sometimes he's the next husband, sometimes he's a fucking monster. Like she doesn't know what's coming. That big question mark. And I think, I think people like Diana Quincy have done that very well. I think there are a number of authors who have like figured out how to do that sort of like Duchess on the ropes really well. Sophie Jordan's most recent book, The Duchess, in her Scandalous Ladies of London book, does this. So I just think, I think there's something to be said for, you're absolutely right. And I think that goes back to what we said at the beginning about historicals being able to tell these like kind of political stories. I do want to give a shout out to Adriana Herrera for this book isn't out until next year, but her next book, which is called A Tropical Rebel Gets the Duke, is a really interesting framing of this like inheritance, like surprise dukedom inheritance. The hero of this book, Apollo, who we know from the other 2 books in the series, is, has basically like come in and he's been revealed as the legitimate heir to the dukedom. And he is ready to claim all power he can, like, he is there for the power. And Adriana has like flipped this on its head in a lot of ways, because he is a Black man from the Dominican Republic, I want to say, from like a Caribbean island, who returns to England to basically say, like, now I get my space. And I think that's a great example of how, like, modern historicals are, like, starting in many ways, because finally we have authors of color and queer authors writing these books, being able to, like, flip the whole script on its head.
Oh, do super interesting things with it. So I was going to talk about A Duke, the Lady, and a Baby by Vanessa Riley, which I think does a lot of super interesting things. Like, so Patience is the heroine. Her husband, she is from the West Indies. Her husband is, has died, a suicide, right? Like something mysterious. And essentially her baby essentially has been taken from her because he's the heir, right? And or I don't know, like whatever. But she's essentially like pretending or like essentially acting as like her own child's nursemaid, like literally like wet nurse, while the new Duke kind of rolls into town. And one of the things that I think is really interesting about this book, like truly fascinating, is that it's dual point of view, and her chapters are in first person and his chapters are in third past, right? First past and third past. And I think it's just like Vanessa is so thoughtful about like what would this be like, right? Like and whose like character can I inhibit in a different way or like give in a different kind of narration. And it was just like, I think that like that's like another example of a book that is just like truly like taking that Duke archetype and really showing us like from the jump, here are two characters who really do not trust each other foundationally, and you get why Patience does not, right? And so I think like that's the other thing is, I mean, I'm on record on this episode for really loving like, girls and dresses and parties and all that sort of stuff. But I mean, I think in terms of like, again, like these most recent books, we have really interesting like work being done where people are saying like, hey, let me take a swing at this from a completely different point of view.
It's worth pointing out that last year, 2 years ago, Alexis Hall put out A Lady for a Duke, which again, like really transforming, or at least like setting a stake in the ground in historical. It's really emotional. I mean, the heroine is a trans woman who served in battle alongside a Duke, and at I think it's at Waterloo is essentially fakes her own death, or not, doesn't fake her own death. She is presumed dead at Waterloo as a soldier, and she, instead of returning home and resuming her identity as a man, she allows that person to be named dead and then returns to the world as like living her true self as Viola. Her like closest friend there on the battlefield was a Duke. And when it is years later and they reconnect, and it turns out that like her death has really shattered him to the level of which like he's like isolated himself away from society, away from like anything even approximating like feeling. And she turns up, and they like have this very emotional romance. And again, a story that could not have been told, years ago in historical, because we just weren't open in that way to authors who could flip the script.
I don't know. I mean, I just feel like don't discount them. You know what I mean? Like I don't know. I just love historical so much. Obviously you do.
I mean, obviously I do. I will say I want to give a shout out to, I already mentioned Sophie Jordan, but one of my very favorites of her series is the Duke Hunt series, which is the most recent of her mass market historicals. And it's such a fun concept, and it's like, it really is playing with historical readers. And my favorite thing, I think, now about modern historicals is that so many of us who like grew up reading old school historicals are like playing with the reader always. Like, we get it. You know the rules. And so we're showing you like all the funny little things that are sort of accepted in historicals and are really very silly. And in the Duke Hunt, the concept is, in the first one, the hero is discovered. Let me just pull it up so that I have all the names. In the first one, which is called The Duke Goes Down. Perfect. No notes. The hero discovers, like, it becomes clear that he was to be the heir to the dukedom, but it becomes clear that he is no longer. He was born before his mother and father were married. So he is illegitimate in the eyes of, the law. And so he cannot inherit the dukedom. And so here he is, like, no longer a duke. And then in the second one, and then the big question is like, well, who is the Duke then? And so each one of the books in the series kind of tackles it in a different way. Like, so their dukedom is in constant flux over the course of the series. And like in the third one, which is the one with the lady blacksmith called The Scoundrel Falls Hard, like that one is about like, he's kind of a con artist. Like he's been sort of trying to con his way into this dukedom. Or at least his father has. So like there are all these really interesting ways that Sophie is playing with the Duke's inheritance. And then, of course, in the final one, the actual Duke is the hero and the heroine is a housekeeper, right? Which we didn't even talk about class differences in this, which is a whole separate sort of gift that the Duke gives us.
Well, and I think I want to mention, I know we're like at time, but Flowers from the Storm, which has a Duke who has like a medical crisis. And then his family is all too happy to essentially like put him in an asylum and hopefully never see him again while they strip the like dukedom for parts and finally have like the control of it that they wanted, and he would never let go. And I think this Quaker, Maddie girl comes along and she's like essentially acting as his nursemaid. And the thing that's really fascinating though is like the inversion of how she helps him. But then like at the end, right, like there's this like great run of the book where he's like, okay, like in order to get out of this mess, I now have to be more ducal than ever. Right? I have to like, and she is so outraged by it. Like, what are you doing? And it's really like this kind of terrific, I don't know, like kind of like masterclass. And like, here's how the power of this, the power of the dukedom almost divorced from, like the people itself. Right. So, I think that there's just like, if you were like, whatever you want to read about, you know what I mean? Like there is a book that's doing it in historical, that's doing it with dukes, that you could really dive into something so interesting.
Yeah. I mean, I think, again, I know we're at time, but I do think like it's worth us sort of like naming a couple of some like great Duke books. I think I mentioned Diana Quincy because she's done a few of them, but the one that I think of is like, if you're interested in an idle Duke who like has to get his like head out of his ass, The Duke Who Ravished Me is terrific. It's also class difference. He's a duke, she's a governess. Tessa Dare does a million of them. I mean, like, Tessa's written 1,000 million dukes.
Of course. Meredith Duran, who I think does not write anymore, but Duke of Shadows
is so good.
Is so good. I mean, it's really like dealing into like, talk about like colonialism. I mean, essentially they were in India and then they go back to London and, like Meredith, I think was a professor or a history person. And so, just like really diving in, but like that book is a banger. Well, good. I can mention No Good Duke Goes Unpunished, which is probably probably my favorite of your
There
dukes.
are a lot of them.
Although it's hard to say because I like them, but there are a lot of them. But I am very interested in the sort of, I tried to leave it all behind, right? Like I got accused of something. My name was besmirched and I walked away from that. And then, they pulled me back in. I love that. So that's no good duke goes unpunished.
Obviously, we are avowed Lorraine Heath fans here. Any Duke book of Lorraine's, you should
so many.
tackle. I mean, our favorite is Waking Up with the Duke, which it really grapples with responsibility on like multiple layers. Also tackles the question of like the heir piece is we didn't even touch on, but like that is obviously a huge responsibility.
I think if you're interested in like a duke who truly is a bad guy and he needs to be redeemed, you could read Duke of Sin by Elizabeth Hoyt. Now, that's book 10 of the Maid Lane series. And so if you just like pick it up cold, you don't really get a sense of just how awful he was. But I think in some ways, I think of him as like truly being a truly terrible person. I mean, I just was like, no way you could redeem him. And then I was like, damn it.
If you want a sort of like hero, a like duke with a stick up his ass who like has never felt a feeling and like never asked for help, but like has to learn how to like break down. Duke of My Heart by Kelly Bowen is basically like Scandal, but make it Regency era. Kelly Bowen writes a great book.
Wow. Yeah.
And then if you want a Duke book with like some revenge in it, like who doesn't love like, this is the other piece of it is all of these are like incredibly powerful men who just have to be taken down a peg. That's my favorite kind of Duke. Miranda Neville, who unfortunately passed away a while ago and no longer writes, but like her, The Duke of Dark Desires, which is the black one. The cover is so stunning because you never see black covers. But it is, he hires a governess intending to seduce her to like exact revenge on his like enemy. And she not realizing that she already knows that that's his game. And so she is in it to like destroy him. Kate Noble, I do love her. She
love
has
her. Any favorite Anne Mallory dukes?
She must have a duke. I mean, everybody has a duke. Does Sherry Thomas? Who's Sherry Thomas's duke?
Beguiling the Beauty is the Duke of Lexington. Yeah, that's a good one.
And then, of course, there are all the classics, right? There's Dane.
There is Kingston, St. Vincent, right?
And then there are all the classics. You said Stephanie Lawrence's, Devil's Bride. Obviously, there's the Bridgerton Duke. Eloisa James has a full the Duchesses series from Eloisa James.
A Kingdom of Dreams, Sarah.
The greatest. Just stop now. Go read Kingdom of Dreams. Listen to the deep dive.
What I Did for a Duke by Julianne Long is a real fan favorite. And people really love that book. And although it is not the first in a series, I think you could probably read it as a standalone.
You can read it separately. There's sexy ice skating in that book. I love it so much.
Although Dane is not a duke, she does have some. Doesn't she have some dukes? It isn't Lord Impossible.
Mr. Impossible?
Lord Perfect.
No, isn't he I don't know. He's such a himbo. He can't possibly be a duke. Is he a duke? I'm going to look.
Dukes Prefer Blondes by Loretta Chase and A Duke in Shining Armor and 10 Things I Hate About the Duke. She has the Difficult Duke series. Come on.
The Hazards of Dating. The Hazards of Dukes is another Megan Frampton series. Megan Frampton knows how to do it. So anyway, the point is we love Dukes here at Fated Mates, and if you also love Dukes, or if you're willing to like give us a try. Also, if you are not a historical reader but would like a modern day Duke, I did write one of those. It's short and it's cheap and cheerful, as my mother would say. But it's a little novella. It's called A Duke Worth Falling For.
A Duke Worth Fighting
he's
For,
a
Sarah.
secret Duke. He doesn't like to be in public. Poor baby. Poor baby. Anyway, so yeah. Tell us about your favorite dukes. There are so many. We are not short on them here in romance.
There are lots of them. I mean, they far outnumber the number of actual dukes, but same with billionaires. And
we should have said that at the beginning. There are only like 16 dukes. I will put a link in show notes to the article that has a photograph of every, I mean, it's actually probably out of date, but like it was, 10 years ago, there was an article in Tatler or something, and it had a photograph of every single duke. They were all together. And it's pretty great. Anyway, I'm Sarah McLean. I'm here with my friend Jen Prokop. We are Fated Mates. You can find us every Wednesday at fatedmates.net or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can tell us in comments there about your favorite dukes. You can also tell us on Twitter at Fated Mates, on Instagram at Fated Mates Pod. We are on Blue Sky. We are on Threads. We are, everywhere a little bit.
Is that everywhere dukes are sold?
Everywhere dukes are sold. Yeah, you can find us in all of those places. You can also, if you just love talking about romance novels, this was a real bantery episode. If you love this conversation, you definitely would love the Discord, which you get access to when you join our Patreon. Patreon members get one extra episode of the podcast a month and also access to a Discord where people are talking about romance novels 24/7. You can learn more about that at patreon.com/fatedmates. And just as a reminder, if you stay after this week's episode, you'll get a special audio excerpt of Faye Delacour's The Lady He Lost. Thanks to Faye for sponsoring this week's episode.
1. 1839. Lieutenant Eleazar Williams was resurrected on a Sunday, which, though fitting, proved terribly inconvenient for his family. The Williamses were just getting ready to attend church, where, it so happened, they intended to light a candle for their departed son, now some 2 years in his watery grave, when their butler announced a visitor. "It's the young Mr. Williams," he gasped, his face white. "Return to us." This statement produced some confusion, for Eli's younger brother was away on his grand tour, and therefore a more likely candidate for an unexpected return. "But he's just reached Rome," protested Mrs. Williams. "Why should he have come home now?" "Not Jacob, ma'am," the servant amended. "Eleazar." At that moment, Eli himself walked into the room, looking nothing like a man long drowned. He was breathing, his flesh was a healthy tan, and he wasn't even wet. "Hello," said Eli. Mrs. Williams screamed and fell into a dead faint. Her daughter barely managed to catch her before she hit the ground. With a stagger and a grunt, she tipped her mother towards the settee. Hannah was a sturdy girl. "Good God!" cried Mr. Williams. "We thought you had drowned." "No," replied Eli. "Terribly sorry to have frightened you." Needless to say, no one made it to church that morning. "The most important thing," Jane Bishop began, with an earnest look to the pair of ladies before her, "is never to wager more than you're prepared to lose, both in life and in card play." It might seem self-evident, but a remarkable number of people couldn't grasp this principle. They left more than they could afford on the table, or took risks with their hearts or their reputations that no sensible person would counsel. Not Jane, though. She knew exactly what her odds in life were, poor, especially in the financial sense, and how to best safeguard against future risk. Don't play a losing game. It had served her well thus far. "Wait a minute." Miss Reva Chatterjee frowned and tilted her head, her long lashes shadowing her dark eyes. She was several years younger than Jane, and spoke with the sort of innocence only a debutante could muster. "I thought you said the most important thing was to always hold if you reach 17. No, I said you must always hold if you reach 19. If you have 17, it depends on the other players and whether you have an ace or not. If you memorize my chart, you'll see how it all works." Another thing most people didn't seem to understand was that gambling wasn't actually a risk if you understood maths. At least, not for the house. Miss Chatterjee shot an uneasy look to the large piece of foolscap on the table between them. Jane had written out every possible combination the dealer might draw relative to the players, and indicated where one should hold or seek another card to maximize the chances of winning, shrinking her neat script to the most minuscule proportions to fit everything in. What better way could there be to show their newest helper the ropes? All she needed to do was to follow it perfectly, and profits were guaranteed. Cordelia Danby, Della to her friends, cleared her throat delicately.
"Jane, dear, I thought we agreed that the chart was a bit much to start with, and we were just going to focus on the other rules for now."
It had been Della's idea to invite Miss Chatterjee to join them this morning. They'd agreed that they needed to train a third dealer if they were to have any hope of expanding their card club, and Miss Chatterjee was the logical choice. She was a regular member and a trusted friend of Della's, but she was already starting to look a bit overwhelmed by the vast array of possibilities listed on the page. Jane loved the numbers best, but not everyone shared her enthusiasm. Oh dear. Della was going to be cross with her if she scared the poor girl off. They'd managed well enough on their own thus far, but they were starting to have too many guests to continue without help. They needed this to work. "You're quite right," Jane conceded, with a last regretful glance at her chart. "We can cover that next week. Let's get back to not wagering too much. That was the part I wanted to tell you about. It isn't just yourself you need to keep in check, it's the guests as well. You'll need to step in if they're being too extravagant."
"But isn't it good if the ladies wager a lot?"
Miss Chatterjee shot a hesitant look to Della.
"Then we'll win more."
"That's what I've been saying," Della agreed. She had a cherubic face and laughing brown eyes that lit up when she was excited. That, combined with her short, plump figure and high-pitched voice, gave her an almost childlike appearance, though her character was anything but innocent. "No." Jane pressed her palms to the table. They'd been over this 100 times. Della might be her dearest friend, but they held opposite views on what constituted an acceptable level of risk. It probably came from being born to such different circumstances. Della had never needed to worry much about how her life would turn out, with her parents as wealthy as they were. "The goal of our card club is to make a steady profit, not a quick one. If we have to explain to an angry father how his daughter came to lose the family rubies over a game of 21, we'll be shut down within a week." Miss Chatterjee considered this a moment before she nodded, and Della wilted a bit at the loss of her ally. Before Jane could savour the victory, a rap on the door interrupted them. "Drat, not Edmund. I told him I was using the study this morning." But it wasn't Jane's brother who entered the room a moment later. It was her uncle. "Good morning," he nodded to their guests. "Jane, darling, I'm so sorry to interrupt your callers, but I'm going out and I simply must know what sort of fabric you'd like me to order, or we won't have time to make you a new gown for Cecily's rout. You've been putting me off all week." Jane suppressed a sigh. Not this again. Some people suffered the trials of the matchmaking mammas of the ton, those tenacious, indefatigable creatures who flitted from one ballroom to the next, ensuring the reproduction of the upper classes with only marginal inbreeding. Jane had no such figure in her life. Instead, she was blessed with a matchmaking uncle. Though he might not have seemed the most likely choice for the role, Uncle Bertie had risen to the challenge of conquering the London season with remarkable enthusiasm. Almost, dare one say it, too much enthusiasm. "Thank you, Uncle, but I really don't need anything new." They couldn't afford anything new, truth be told, but Bertie believed that Jane's wardrobe expenses should be dictated by his affection rather than his finances. "I was planning to wear that cream gown with the gold flowers on it." "Jane!" He stomped one foot so sharply it made her jump. "You've worn it twice already. How shall we ever find you a husband if you won't make an effort to look your best?" Jane risked a glance at Della, who understood her anguish and was trying valiantly not to laugh. Uncle Bertie followed her gaze, adopting his most inviting tone as he addressed their guests. "Girls, you'd love to go to the modiste together, wouldn't you? Talk some sense into my niece. Wouldn't she look lovely in a new gown?" A look of mild panic flitted across Miss Chatterjee's face. She obviously hadn't counted on being thrust into a family squabble when she'd called this morning. Indeed, Jane had been quite safe from this sort of thing only last year, when Cecily was still at home to serve as the centre of Bertie's universe. But now that his own daughter was happily married, he had fixed his sights squarely upon his niece. She loved Uncle Bertie, but being the sole object of his enthusiasm could be a bit exhausting. "What is it you girls are doing in here, anyway?" Bertie had finally noticed the chart of all the 21 hands stretched out on the table between them. Jane might have shoved it out of view had she been a bit quicker, but she couldn't bear to crease the page. She'd worked so hard on it. "Nothing," she blurted out. "We were just—" Oh, goodness. What feminine pursuit could this giant list of numbers possibly resemble? Calligraphy practice? Dance steps, perhaps?
"It's a ranking system for eligible gentlemen,"
Della supplied without missing a beat. How does she come up with these ideas of hers? Unlike Jane, who never had a fib ready when she needed one, Della's silver tongue was the solution to, or the cause of, many a scrape. "Beg pardon?" Uncle Bertie drew his greying brows together in confusion. "How would one rank gentlemen?" "Yes, Della, how would one rank gentlemen?" What a thing to choose.
"It's simple, really. You just assign a value for attributes, such as income, good manners, temperament, and so forth, and then you add up the total to see if the gentleman in question would be a good match."
Bertie stared at the paper for so long that Jane began to worry he'd seen through their trick. When he finally spoke, there was a hint of disappointment in his tone. "I know one must consider practicalities, but in my day, young people used to hope for a love match. Oh, well, I suppose I should be happy you're taking an interest in your future." His index finger traced the first column on the page. "Tell me, which gentleman does this one represent? Who is your best match?" Oh, Lord. With 3 seasons behind her already and nothing to show for it but a split sole on her favourite dancing slippers, Jane had all but given up on attracting a husband. Only Bertie's steadfast faith kept her from voicing her thoughts aloud. He'd been so good to her and Edmund after their parents died. Surely she could muster a better effort for his sake. But no matter how Jane tried to follow the path that was expected of her, the task proved impossible. No one wanted an orphaned lady without any dowry for a wife, much less one who aspired to run a clandestine gambling club. Even if she could find a gentleman willing to overlook her poverty, marriage would be nothing but a losing game for her, the sort of risk she couldn't afford to take. Without any funds to settle on herself or her future children, she would be entirely dependent on her husband. If he mismanaged his fortune or died unexpectedly, she would be left with nothing all over again, a poor relation shuffled from house to house, forever unwanted. She couldn't endure that. Far better to make her own way in life if Jane could manage it. Once she and Della had earned enough money to prove their club could work, she would explain everything to Bertie and make him understand.
That's Mr. Macpherson,"
her friend offered when Jane hesitated too long. Mr. Macpherson had spoken to Jane for 10 minutes after the opera last month, and then danced with her exactly twice the following evening. That had propelled him to the status of her most promising suitor, at least in Uncle Bertie's estimation. How lovely! His mood brightened once more at this news. The prospect of a match always had this effect, no matter how unlikely. "I did think he took a particular interest in—" "Jane, you're frowning. We've talked about this, darling. You cannot afford to wrinkle your brow at 23.
"I'm not frowning. That's just my face," Jane sighed.
though she endeavoured to turn the corners of her mouth upward instead of down. It cost her some effort, given that she was fairly certain her uncle would be on the subject of her future marriage to Mr. Macpherson for the rest of the day, all thanks to Della. There was no chance they would finish preparing Miss Chatterjee now.
"Do you know something, Uncle? I've had a change of heart. I believe we shall go to the shops this morning."
"Lovely. I'll have the carriage prepared."
"No need. We'll stop by Della's first and get a few things. Then we'll take hers."
Della and Jane lived on the same street, so close they were practically neighbours. They were in the habit of dropping in on one another this way. She shot her friend a look, trusting her to understand. The excuse would satisfy Bertie and give them the freedom to continue their work undisturbed. Her uncle looked so pleased, Jane almost felt guilty. She didn't like to lie to him, but how else was she supposed to accomplish anything? Their plans were too important to put off. The ladies stood to go, when Bertie suddenly produced an envelope from his coat pocket. "I almost forgot. There was a letter for you." Jane glanced down as she took it. Her name and address were scrawled in the centre by a neat hand, but the sender's name was absent. Odd. She gently tore open one edge, unfolded the short missive, and read, "Dearest Jane, I am alive and recently returned to England. Allow me to come to you to explain things in person. I am so very sorry for the grief I have caused. Eli Williams." Jane's heart was pounding by the end as her eyes struggled to make sense of the words. It was impossible. Eli had died nearly 2 years ago. Everyone knew that. Was this someone's idea of a cruel joke? Unbidden, her mind flashed back to his funeral service, Cecily wailing dramatically over an empty coffin, drowning out his mother and sister. Jane hadn't felt it was her place to weep openly in the face of all that. What was she but a friend? Instead, she'd swallowed the lump in her throat 100 times and held herself together by force of will until she was back in the privacy of her bedroom, at last free to indulge in her own grief. She read the letter a second time, but it refused to transform into anything like a coherent explanation under her gaze. She felt sick to her stomach. Everyone was staring at her. "Well, Jane, is it a billet doux from Mr. Macpherson? What's the matter? You're frowning again."
"No."
She folded up the letter and assumed a neutral expression for Uncle Bertie, who was watching her expectantly, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. She couldn't share this with him. It was too vile.
"No, it's just a letter from—"
She searched for something plausible and uninspiring, dropping her attention to the envelope. The only clue of its origin was in the postmark, indicating it had been paid for in Plymouth.
"From Cousin Henrietta. She writes that everyone is well, and the weather is very fair in Devon."
There, that was good. It was from the right part of the country. The Williamses and their cousins were neighbours, although she may have been pressing her luck to say the weather was fair in Devon. Uncle Bertie gasped. "Has Mrs. Bishop had her accouchement?" Drat. Not such a good fib after all. She hadn't been thinking.
"Not that they mention. I must presume she is still unaccouched."
"It should be soon now," he continued, a crease marring his brow. The subject of his older brother's offspring was a sensitive one. While John Bishop was blessed with the whole of the family fortune and an entailed country estate, he had never been blessed with a son. Every few years he attempted to remedy this, and Bertie waited on pins and needles to learn if another girl would join the ranks of her sisters. The whole business was of no concern to Jane, of course, but Edmund stood to be a good deal richer one day if the much-anticipated baby turned out to be the right sex. Or the wrong one, depending on one's point of view.
"Anyway, we must be off,"
Jane said briskly. If she'd been eager to escape before, the letter had lit a fire beneath her. Bertie saw them on their way down the road before he bid them farewell and went to attend his own errands. They only had to walk 5 minutes past the series of white stucco townhouses, identical save for the curtains on their sash windows or the contents of their flower boxes, and then they were at the Danbys. It was considerably larger inside and more richly furnished than the rest, a reminder of her family's fortune. Still, Jane didn't suffer any pangs of envy. She and Edmund were extremely fortunate to have a relation willing to take them in and look to their comfort after their parents' deaths. Though Uncle Bertie's income was limited, he treated them like his own, and Uncle John supplemented their welfare with the occasional gift or invitation for a summer visit when he was feeling charitable. She was lucky to have this much.
"We're not really going to the Modiste, I expect,"
Della said the moment they were safely indoors. "Of course not."
"Good. Let's go upstairs. My rooms are the only place we're sure not to be disturbed."
This was most likely true, as they could already hear her siblings quarrelling somewhere down the hall. They followed Della to a large room cluttered with papers, a neglected watercolour that had stood half-finished since last Christmas, and several boxes of quilting supplies, her most recent passion. The maids were powerless to impose order on the space, in the face of Della's insistence that she had a method to her madness. In a perfect demonstration of said method, she kicked a box under her bed to clear a path to the armchairs and gathered up all the odds and ends on the table to tuck them in a corner, most likely never to be thought of again.
"There. Now then, where were we?" "Don't let anyone gamble the family rubies, I believe,"
Miss Chatterjee supplied. They spent another half-hour preparing their newest helper for her responsibilities, but to Jane's horror, she found her mind kept wandering back to the letter as they spoke. It was a prank, of course. It wasn't worth another minute of her time, not when they had Miss Chatterjee before them and had finally escaped the distractions that threatened their progress. She had money to make, and precious little privacy in which to do so.
"Is anything the matter?"
Della murmured, once Miss Chatterjee had departed, Jane's borrowed copy of Hoyle's Games tucked under one arm and a promise to read it on her lips. The opening chapters on probability in games of chance were quite good, if less detailed than Jane might like.
"You don't seem quite yourself. You didn't even mention your chart again."
Jane produced the letter from her reticule and handed it over. It seemed easier than explaining. As Della unfolded the small note and read, her eyes grew rounder and rounder.
"By God! Lieutenant Williams is alive?"
Della was not prone to uttering oaths, so this was no small sign of her shock. "Of course he isn't. This has to be some malicious person's idea of a joke." Jane fought back a touch of impatience. It was obvious that this was a hoax. Wasn't it?
"But,"
Della bit her lower lip,
"who would ever joke about something like that? And why would they want to target you?"
Jane had no answer to that. It wasn't as though she had enemies. The most offensive thing she'd done was step on a dance partner's toes, or perhaps frown if one asked Uncle Bertie. She couldn't think why anyone would be so cruel as to fake a resurrection. "It might be someone from our ladies' club," Jane said hesitantly. "Mrs. Muller lost quite a lot last week." £3, 2 shillings to be exact. Jane kept the tallies stored carefully in a ledger on her bedside table, but she could recall each one down to the last penny. Those numbers were her future.
"You don't really think she's the sort to try something like this, do you?"
Della looked back to the note, her lips pressed together in disbelief. In truth, none of the ladies in their card club seemed a likely culprit. Jane and Della curated their list of invitees carefully, passing over those who might speak too freely of their endeavour or start a scandal. They only admitted people they could trust. But if the note wasn't from an angry debtor, what explanation was there? "Lieutenant Williams is dead," Jane said firmly. She was sure of it. Not so sure as she had been an hour ago, admittedly, but still at least 98% sure. 97 at the worst.
"But they never found a body,"
Della said with some hesitation.
"And some of his crewmates survived the shipwreck, didn't they?"
"Yes," Jane admitted. That was what she'd read in the papers, at least. The HMS Libertas had been wrecked in shallow waters during a skirmish with pirates off the coast of Greece. Most of her crew had escaped safely before a great wave dashed the ship against the rocks and dragged the last few men under. Poor Eli had never washed ashore. She shuddered. But it's been nearly 2 years. If he had survived— She couldn't believe she was saying that. There would have been some sign of him sooner than this, and I doubt I'm the first person he would write to. Della glanced back at the note she still held in her hand, raising one eyebrow pointedly at the salutation.
Dearest Jane.
Jane snatched the note back, her face growing hot.
I didn't realize you two were on such intimate terms.
This isn't from him, so it says nothing whatsoever of what sort of terms were on. Della had a point, though. Whoever had written the letter must have known that she'd granted Eli permission to use her given name, which they had only done in private. Not to mention the presumption of a gentleman writing to her while she was unmarried. Who could possibly have the means to know she and Eli were so close?
I wonder if he calls Cecily his dearest,
Della mused.
Do you think she received anything?
Cecily. Jane made a regretful sound halfway between a sigh and a harumph. It's none of my concern if she has. In truth, Jane hadn't even thought of her cousin. She would have to ask, though. Or perhaps she wouldn't. Cecily didn't exactly keep secrets. If she'd had a dramatic letter, the whole ton would know soon enough.
If he is back—
He is not.
But if he is,
Della continued doggedly,
he and Cecily aren't— well, you know, she's gone and married someone else now.
Yes. Jane pressed her lips together, not quite certain of what she might say next if she kept talking. Better not to say anything. 5 years later, and she was still nursing that wound. When would it heal? Della was staring at her expectantly. When it became apparent that Jane was not going to speak, her friend took up the task.
He would finally be free for you.
He was free for me before he formed an engagement with Cecily, you will recall. He made his choice. Her cousin, not her. Cecily was everyone's favourite. A touch prettier, a great deal more amiable, and endowed with that nameless ability to draw every eye in the room. Jane didn't expect the eligible gentlemen Uncle Bertie ferreted out to pay her any attention when Cecily was nearby, even now that she was married. But Eli had been different. They'd become friends when Cecily wasn't around. They'd been close enough that she'd imagined an attachment there, imagined that she might be first in his heart. She'd been wrong.
But, Jane, you aren't going to hold that against him, are you? It's all in the past now that she's married and he's—
Della was obliged to pause here, searching for the correct term. Jane supplied it for her. Miraculously restored to life with no explanation after 2 years unaccounted for?
Well,
Della sighed.
When you put it that way, I suppose it does seem ill done.
Precisely. Even if Eli was alive, a possibility which Jane was now willing to fix at a generous 5%, he had whittled away his time while everyone believed him dead, never bothering to set ink to paper and put an end to their grief, never bothering to put an end to her grief. She may not have been the one he'd promised to marry, but Jane had mourned him all the same. It was unforgivable. The man I knew would never have shown such disregard for other people's feelings. If Lieutenant Williams really is alive, I can only conclude that I gravely mistook his character. Della made no reply to this, but only looked back at her with a regretful sort of softness in her eyes. She took Jane's hand into hers and pressed it gently, and after a long moment suggested they take some tea downstairs, where they would speak no more about Lieutenant Williams and this mysterious letter. And that was why Cordelia Danby was her dearest friend.